I'm going to explain the four main reasons sociologists give for the secularisation thesis. So if you need to explain the secularisation thesis, stick around. Tom from the sociologytutor.com here. What is the secularisation thesis? The secularisation thesis refers to the prediction that sociologists and academics made in the 50s and 60s that religion would decline in modern societies, that religious institutions would lose their significance and people would stop participating in religious activities. The process of modernisation would lead to the decline of religion. Now, before we go any further, globally, religion is growing at the moment. So secularisation thesis on a global scale has been proved wrong. Islam is growing rapidly around the world. Christianity is growing rapidly in China. However, some sociologists argue the secularisation thesis does apply to the UK and Europe. That's because if you ask people in the UK, are they religious? The majority of people will say no. So it does seem to apply. However, other sociologists would disagree and say it's not that people are less religious, it's simply that religious participation is changing. The way people participate is changing. So that the secularisation thesis doesn't even apply in the UK and Europe. So if you want to know more arguments against the secularisation thesis and a more thorough definition of secularisation, check out my videos. Links are in the description below. Let's get started. As societies modernise and become dominated by rational and scientific thinking, religion has less significance, there's less space for religion because science and rational, when I say rational I mean evidence-based thinking, replaces the need for religious explanations. The key theorist for rationalisation driving secularisation is Max Weber. Weber argued the secularisation of Europe begins with the rationalisation of European society in the 1600s. Prior to the 1600s, in medieval Britain, the Catholic Church dominated life. It dominated thinking. Everyone was Catholic. There were few alternatives. The Catholic faith taught people that they had a way of influencing whether they were going to heaven or hell. So, for example, they could buy blessed items or bones of saints. They could go on pilgrimages to a holy place to show their devotion. They could, if they were wealthy, make donations to the church. They also believed that God was in everyday life. They had what we describe as an enchanted worldview, that if someone became ill, their explanation for it was they were in some way being punished by God. So they saw God, they saw saints, angels, etc. as part of everyday life. Every explanation was taken back to God's will. What was God's thinking? Did God favour me or not favour me? The Protestant Reformation began in the 1500s in Europe. This refers to the spread of the Protestant faith throughout Europe. The Catholic Church lost its monopoly, its total control of what people believed, and the Protestant faith grew significantly. Protestants took a very different view of the world to Catholics. They argued that God had created the world, but he wasn't in the world on a day-to-day basis. God was seen like the master clockmaker. He had started the world going and now it was sort of ticking along of its own accord. If you take that worldview and you no longer look for religious explanations for day-to-day events in life, what then happens is it opens up a space for science, for evidence-based thinking to start explaining what's happening to people. And gradually over time, Weber says this leads to what he calls the disenchantment of society. People no longer see religious explanations for explaining these events, and society becomes increasingly more rational. As it becomes more rational, there are fewer and fewer things that religion is needed to explain, because science and technology can explain the majority of things. This is the beginning of the process of the secularisation of society. Bruce interprets this now as something that he calls a technological worldview. We're so advanced now that there are so few things that we need religion to explain that religion has declined, that we become a secular society. Talcott Parsons argues it's due to the Industrial Revolution and the industrialisation of society. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the church did a great number of different roles or functions or jobs for people. So it would have done Sunday schools, so the only free education many children would have got would have been in a church school. If people were experiencing extremely hard times, they might have been able to get some benefits or food from the church. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, we can see the church as in so many different parts of people's lives. What then happens is something called structural differentiation. This refers to institutions like the church specialising in just one function. They give up all of their other functions. Of course, the church's primary and main function is spiritual matters. The church is no longer as influential in those other sectors of society, those other institutions like education, welfare. And what that's led to is the privatisation of religion. People are more individualistic, they practice their religion at home a bit more. And of course, that gradually over time leads to churches losing their significance in society and society becoming secularised. Another way industrialisation has led to the decline in significance of religion is because of the decline of close-knit communities. In pre-industrial societies, when people worshipped, they worshipped as a community, and those rituals, those processes of worshipping as a group bound the group together and regulated people's behaviour. But with the loss of communities, there's a loss of power of the church over those individuals. People can be much more individualistic. There's not that fear of they're not seen in church, people are going to look down on them. So as people flock to cities and communities are broken up and there's more individualisation, religion loses its hold, because previously part of its hold was based on the fact that the community worshipped together. Now the key thinker for that is Wilson. He's the person who focused on this idea that industrial society loses community, which means that religion loses its hold over individuals. Another consequence of the modernisation and diversification of society is there's much more religious diversity, which makes it harder to believe in any single religion. So Berger argues religious diversity leads to the decline of all religious worship. Now, put simply, the idea is that if there are many, many different options, how can one religious faith be true? If they're all claiming to be true, then they all actually lose their value, and actually what ends up happening is people worship a lot less. This process began, again, with the Protestant Reformation. So Berger argues, before the rise of the Protestant faith in Europe, if we look at the medieval period when the Catholic Church dominated, that was the only faith, to believe in Catholicism and to be a Catholic was normal. Everyone was doing it. There was no reason to sort of question it, and therefore it had what Berger calls a high plausibility structure. If something is plausible, it means it's believable. So what he's saying here is it was very easy to believe in the Catholic Church at that time because that was the only church available. There was no one suggesting an alternative. Berger uses the term the sacred canopy to refer to Europe in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, in the 13th century. And he uses that sacred canopy because it's this idea that the Catholic Church dominated every aspect of religious, social, political thinking. And therefore it was very easy to believe in the Catholic teachings because there really was no alternative. So it's a sacred canopy in a sense that the Catholic Church went over all of Europe at that time. The Protestant Reformation begins in the 1500s, and what we see is the rise of the Protestant faith in Europe. And of course then there are lots of different variations of the Protestant faith as well, and we see the emergence of religious diversity happening. That then creates is a problem for the believer. Who do they believe in? Is it Protestant? Is it Catholic? Now of course people during that period, the 1500s, 1600s, were still very religious, but ultimately it starts this process of religious diversity. There are too many options, and people then start not believing in any religion at all, because how can they believe in one when there's so many claiming to be true? Let's consider 4 quick evaluations you can use in your answers. A positive evaluation of secularisation thesis is the fact that Europe and the UK seem to prove the theory correct. So the UK is one of only 5 countries in the world where when they ask people in surveys, are you religious? The majority of the people in the UK will say they're not. The other countries are almost all in Europe. So Europe and the UK do seem to prove secularisation thesis correct, that modern societies become less religious. However, Some sociologists would disagree with that view. They would argue rather than religious participation declining, what's simply happening is it's changing. People are practicing New Age movements, they're practicing religion online, they're not going to traditional places of worship. So sociologists like Leon argue that religion is not declining. In fact, he goes further and says, rather than the rationalisation of society, which Weber predicted, what we're actually experiencing now is the re-enchantment of society. People are re-engaging with religious practices, but it's non-traditional, non-hierarchical, and self-spirituality. So for Leon, secularisation thesis is certainly not happening. Society is becoming re-enchanted. Another counter-argument against secularisation thesis is the growth of the Pentecostal church. The Pentecostal church, a black-led church, is growing rapidly in the UK, and it grows in urban industrial areas. And Christianity is also growing in China, again, urban industrial areas. This shows that religion doesn't need to rely on settled communities, and even in diverse, complex and changing communities that we see in industrial and post-industrial societies, that religion can grow. So it's proving secularisation theory wrong. The final criticism that you can think about is that sociologists such as Peter Berger, who predicted the secularisation thesis to be correct, have now changed their minds. They recognise that they were wrong. And Berger now says what is really happening is actually religious pluralism, a massive diversity of religious options available to people. They're non-hierarchical, they're deinstitutionalised, lots of the ideas we've already mentioned. So he says the best way to characterise the world now is religious pluralism, a big range of options available to people, and religious practices changing rather than religion in this steady downwards decline which the secularisation thesis predicted. Thanks for listening. Check out the links in the description for more information on the secularisation thesis.